Hello everyone. Today we will be examining the Haitian Revolution, in which black slaves in the French Caribbean applied the ideals of the US and French revolutions to their own lives, overthrowing the white elites in the richest colony in the world and establishing the new state of Haiti. The French colony of Saint-Domingue was located on the western side of the island known in English as Hispaniola. The Spanish had ruled the island before the French, forcing the native Taino and Siboney peoples to mine gold and importing slaves when these natives died. The gold reserves in San Domingue dried up, but the French continued to import slaves into their new colony, exploiting them in an extensive plantation system. San Domingue grew into an incredibly lucrative colony, as it provided large profits for French merchants, bankers, and plantation owners, whilst costing the French crown little in upkeep. The wealth of the colony outstripped all of the British possessions in the Caribbean put together. Yet at the same time, San Domingue was tired into relying on French imports to function, further increasing its importance for French commerce. An incredible number of slaves lived in San Domingue. In 1789, it is estimated that the total population of the colony was 556,000 and included roughly 500,000 slaves, 32,000 Europeans, and 24,000 affranchis or biracial residents. Life for slaves in San Domingue was often short. On the plantations, work was rough and dangerous, and tropical disease was ever present. As with the British colonies, the slave population was only sustainable by the importation of more and more Africans, with tens of thousands of new arrivals coming every year. Hierarchies of power in the colony were nuanced, with the biracial colonists owning a quarter of the slaves on the island and sharing in the mistreatment of the blacks, yet being denied the privileges of the whites. The presence of tropical disease also made life for the whites precarious and miserable, but the opportunities to gain wealth and power made the risks more than worth it. Abuses of the slaves by French colonists was extremely commonplace. The atrocities committed are well documented elsewhere on the internet if you want to get a sense of French cruelty towards the black population of San Domingue. But let us just say here that a common punishment was lashing a slave to a post in the swamp and letting the mosquitoes bite them to death or delirium. Sexual assault was not only common, but white men were even expected to have a black woman as their companion during their time on the island in a highly regulated system. The French government responded to the blatant cruelty of French colonists by decreeing the so-called Code Noir that provided certain protections to the slave population whilst at the same time legalizing their servitude. Interestingly, the Code Noir also extensively delineated the rights of freed slaves and biracial colonists, and perhaps as a result of this, free black people in San Domingue enjoyed a greater level of literacy and property ownership than their counterparts in British Jamaica or in the American South. However, many of the stipulations of the Code Noir were simply ignored by the white French colonists in San Domingue, particularly those regarding the limits placed on violence and sexual assault. Black resistance did occur before the revolution. Escaped slaves fled to the mountainous regions of the colony, where they waged guerrilla campaigns against the French. The French referred to these former slaves as marrons. They were known in English as maroons. Maroons were not just content to live in the mountains, but led raids into the plantations, liberating slaves and attacking colonists. One Maroon leader, Francois Macandal, even caused terror among the whites by poisoning the water supply of the colony. The slave population of San Domingue also developed its own culture in opposition to the French. Despite coming from many different parts of the West African coast, the slaves created a polyglot set of traditions influenced by including a religion, voodoo, that was influenced by old Yoruba beliefs and Roman Catholicism, but was very much its own faith. Voodoo was outlawed by the French, but this made it even more effective as a means of encouraging resistance to the Europeans and to their Catholic beliefs. The incredible events of 1789 and 1790, discussed in your textbook, were followed avidly by French colonists in San Domingue. The white colonists had spent the last half a century gradually attempting to chip away at the rights afforded to biracial and freed black people in the colony. They now saw a chance to win their freedom from France entirely and practice their slavery in peace, as the plantation owners of the US South had done. It was not only the white colonists who were inspired by the revolution, however. One rich, biracial colonist, Vincent Auger, was visiting Paris in 1789 and appealed to the new National Assembly to allow wealthy men of color voting rights. A slave owner himself, Auger insisted that he did not want to end slavery, but instead to make free whites and people of color equal. The National Assembly rejected Auger's request, and he returned to San Domingue, where he led an uprising, his army consisting of only free black people and biracial colonists with no black slaves. Defeated by a small French force, Auger fled to the neighboring Spanish colony of Santo Domingo. The Spanish handed Auger over to the French, and he was publicly executed by being broken on the wheel in February 1791. Auger's cruel death outraged the biracial population of San Domingue, who might otherwise have been able to work with the white French. It was clear that race, not property, was the basis for power in the colony. In May 1791, the revolutionary government finally granted actual citizenship to rich biracial citizens, but the whites in San Domingue simply ignored this and continued to discriminate against them. Biracial colonists responded with violence, and by August 1791, following a voodoo ceremony, the entire north of San Domingue erupted in a giant slave revolt. This slave revolt soon grew beyond all expectations, with 100,000 slaves joining in a matter of just weeks. The long years of mistreatment at the hands of the French was repaid by the free black people, with the violence in the rebellion being extreme. Once again, Google the details if you wish to know more. The whites formed a militia and began massacring black people in kind. In just a month, the death toll from the rebellion was reaching towards 20,000, a higher death toll than in the entire Reign of Terror in Paris. The slave revolt was able to capture about a third of the colony, forcing the hand of the National Assembly, which granted full rights and citizenship to every free person of color in San Domingue. This decision was greeted with outrage in the United States, who feared a similar slave revolt in the South. In August 1793, the National Assembly went even further, outlawing slavery altogether. This decision went far too far for the whites in San Domingue, who still controlled the powerful coastal cities. They invited France's enemy, the British, to intervene in the country and restore slavery. British forces landed in September 1793 and set about re-enslaving the black population everywhere they went. The abolition of slavery by France, ratified in the country's 1795 constitution, proved to be a great moral victory of the French over Britain and inspired a degree of nationalism and French identity amongst San Domingue's biracial citizens. The British were not the only force invading San Domingue. They were united in their efforts by a Spanish offensive from Santo Domingo. The Spanish were not attacking the rebellious slaves, however, but were rather coordinating their efforts with them, and fighting against the French, having promised to free the slaves and protect them in return for the slaves' allegiance to Spain. One of the leading commanders in the Spanish offensive was the former slave Toussaint Louverture. A genuinely fascinating figure, Louverture had been freed in 1777 and since then had built up a fair amount of wealth. He was well educated and particularly embraced intellectual ideas with a keen interest. Although he fought against the French revolutionary government, who he did not trust, Louverture employed the language of the French Revolution. In 1793 he famously stated, "I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in San Domingue. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourself to us, brothers, and fight with us in the same cause." Louverture's army was incredibly successful in its endeavors, conquering a large part of San Domingue for Spain. Then, for reasons unknown, but likely relating to the abolition of slavery by the government in Paris, Louverture then switched sides, attacking a Spanish garrison and raising the French tricolour over his camp. He soon succeeded in driving the Spanish out of San Domingue altogether. The British force, meanwhile, fell mostly to disease, losing 5,000 out of their 7,000 men to yellow fever alone. On Christmas Day 1794, the capital of Port-au-Prince, garrisoned by British troops, fell to a slave army. The British threw more men at the problem in the following 3 years. Nearly all of these men subsequently died of yellow fever. Service in Santo Domingue was so unpopular that British soldiers rioted rather than being sent there. In the end, the British lost so many men to yellow fever that it decimated their army for a decade and led them to sign a peace in 1798. Meanwhile, Louverture drilled his army in the latest European methods of warfare, vastly improving its fighting effectiveness. He increasingly had command over large swathes of the north of the colony, with which to do whatever he wished. The south, meanwhile, was the domain of biracial colonists who distrusted Louverture and sought to preserve their autonomy. In the north, the policies that Louverture chose to pursue were controversial. He re-established the plantation economy and even welcomed back white colonists who had left. He also signed the peace with Britain and refused to spread the revolution to British Jamaica. Southerners, such as the military leader André Regard, accused Louverture of wanting to bring back slavery, and a competition grew between the two men, exacerbated by the tensions between biracial and former slaves. The following War of the Knives between the north and south of San Domingue saw a victory for the north and Louverture's forces. The northern army had been led by Louverture's Lieutenant Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was notorious for his treatment of biracial prisoners, many of whom were massacred. By this point, Napoleon had seized control of the French government. Napoleon promised to maintain the abolition of slavery in return for Louverture not invading Spanish Santo Domingo and uniting the island. Louverture ignored this request and conquered Santo Domingo in 1801, abolishing slavery there. Soon after, he drew up a constitution with the aid of white plantation owners. This constitution made Louverture Governor-General for life, and he was able to choose whatever successor he wanted. The constitution confirmed the abolition of slavery, whilst at the same time permitted the use of forced labour and the continued importation of labour from Africa. Catholicism remained the only official faith in the colony, upsetting voodoo practitioners, and the colony also remained part of France. When presented with the constitution, Napoleon was furious. Now married into a slave-owning family via his wife Josephine, the French leader was in no mood to have terms dictated to him by this far-off colony. In December 1801, Napoleon assembled a force to reconquer Saint-Domingue under the command of his own half-brother, General Charles Leclerc. A victory for Napoleon would most likely have seen slavery returned to the island. In yet another incredibly bloody campaign, Louverture's forces held the advantage, but were unable to coordinate their efforts, and a stalemate resulted. Jean-Jacques Dessalines distinguished himself in the way he held off a French offensive, despite being greatly outnumbered, earning him prestige and fame. In the end, Leclerc resumed his efforts to find a diplomatic solution, and the two sides declared a truce. The French, probably manipulated by Dessalines, broke the truce by arresting Louverture, taking him to France, where he died imprisoned. Nonetheless, the French victory was short-lived. Biracial colonists turned against the white French when the latter restored the old caste system in the colony. Napoleon's government also restored slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique, to great outrage in Saint-Domingue. Dessalines led the offensive against the French forces, who, like the British, fell in their thousands to yellow fever. Leclerc himself died of this disease in November 1802. A year later, the French army suffered its final defeat, having to be humiliatingly evacuated by the British Royal Navy. In January 1804, the new nation of Haiti was declared. The island of Hispaniola was nearly entirely devastated, its residents living in miserable poverty, but it was free. Dessalines ordered the death of all French on the island and orchestrated a widespread killing of white and biracial colonists, which has sometimes been referred to as a genocide. He declared himself Emperor Jack I, but was assassinated 2 years later by his own men, who were shocked at his autocratic rule. Another North-South civil war followed. Henri Christophe, who declared himself King Henri I, ruled from the north, and the biracial Alexandre Pétion ruled as president from Port-au-Prince in the south. King Henri managed to improve the country's economy, but at the cost of forcing former slaves to return to work on the plantations. He built a spectacular palace as well as an imposing fortress in the hills to the south of his capital city, where, with soldiers mutinying and coming for him, he committed suicide in 1820. Pétion redistributed land in his state to the peasants. This earned him their respect but also made his country a poor one of small subsistence farmers. He died in 1818 from yellow fever, and the country was reunited as a republic by Jean-Pierre Boyer in 1820. It was not until 1825 that France recognized Haiti's independence, and then only in exchange for a vast amount of money that the new country had to pay off over the course of a century. Haiti remained a poor country, and remains a poor country to this day, but its example has encouraged black revolutionaries around the world to struggle for their freedom to this day.